The United States dollar just hit a 4-year low, and while America is busy watching its own currency bleed out, China is quietly building the architecture to replace it. What you are about to hear is not speculation. This is happening right now, and if you are not paying attention, you are going to wake up one morning in a world where the rules of global money have changed forever. Let me tell you what just happened. In the last week of January 2026, the US dollar index crashed below 96, something we have not seen since early 2022. That is not a dip. That is not a correction. Over the past 12 months alone, the dollar has lost more than 10% of its value. The Bloomberg Dollar Spot Index recorded a 1.2% drop in a single trading session. The euro surged to a 5-year high. The Swiss franc hit levels not seen in a decade. Gold blasted past $5,500 an ounce, a record nobody thought we would see this soon. And while American investors scrambled to figure out what was happening, on the other side of the planet, President Xi Jinping was smiling. Because this is exactly the moment China has been waiting for. If you find this kind of deep dive content valuable, do me a huge favor right now, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. We put a lot of work into researching these stories and bringing them to you with context that mainstream media simply will not give you. Your support keeps this channel going and helps us reach more people who need to understand what is really going on in the world. Now, let me take you behind the curtain. Just days ago, China's Communist Party published something extraordinary in Shoushi, which is the ruling party's most important theoretical journal. The content: excerpts from a speech that President Xi Jinping gave privately to provincial and ministerial officials back in 2024, but that Beijing chose to make public only now. The timing is not a coincidence. Nothing in Chinese politics ever is. In that speech, Xi laid it out in the clearest terms any Chinese leader has ever used. He said that China must build what he called a powerful currency, one that is widely used in international trade, investment, and foreign exchange markets, and that ultimately achieves global reserve currency status. He called for a powerful central bank with financial institutions that can compete on the world stage. He said he wants Shanghai and Shenzhen to become international financial hubs that, in his words, attract global capital and exert influence over global pricing. Let that sink in for a moment. The leader of the world's second-largest economy is not just talking about growing his country's GDP anymore. He is talking about fundamentally rewiring the global financial system. He is talking about replacing the dollar. And here is the thing. A year ago, people would have laughed at that idea. The dollar's dominance seemed unshakable. But everything has changed, and the man most responsible for changing it is not Xi Jinping. Is Donald Trump. Let me walk you through how we got here, because this story is wilder than any thriller Hollywood could come up with. When Trump returned to the White House in January 2025, the dollar index was sitting comfortably near 110. America had the strongest currency in the world, backed by the most powerful economy, the deepest financial markets, and the full faith and credit of the United States government. Fast forward just 1 year, and the picture could not be more different. Trump's tariff policies have been nothing short of chaotic. On April 2, 2025, he announced what he grandly called Liberation Day, slapping massive tariffs on imports from countries all over the world. China got hit the hardest. At one point, U.S. tariffs on Chinese imports were ratcheted up to 125%. But here is what nobody expected. The dollar did not strengthen. It cratered. In any normal world, tariffs push currencies higher, because they reduce imports and tighten the money supply. But the markets were not reacting to the economics of the tariffs. They were reacting to the insanity of the process. Investors looked at the whiplash of policy announcements, the threats one day and reversals the next, and they said, We do not trust this government to manage a lemonade stand, let alone the global reserve currency. And it got worse. Much worse. Trump did not just trash the dollar through trade policy. He launched a full-scale assault on the Federal Reserve, the very institution that gives the dollar its credibility. In 2025, Trump publicly attacked Fed Chairman Jerome Powell over and over again, calling him too late to cut rates, demanding lower interest rates, and saying that anyone who disagrees with him will never become Fed chairman. He attempted to fire Fed Governor Lisa Cook, marking the first time in the Fed's 111-year history that a sitting president tried to remove a standing governor. And then, in January 2026, the Department of Justice launched a criminal investigation into Jerome Powell himself, ostensibly over cost overruns related to a Fed building renovation project. Let me repeat that. The U.S. government opened a criminal investigation into the chairman of the Federal Reserve over a construction project. The markets saw right through it. J.P. Morgan's analysts immediately wrote that they now expected the Fed to stay on hold throughout all of 2026. The dollar dropped further. Investors started talking about something called the Sell America trade, where global money managers simultaneously dump U.S. stocks, U.S. bonds, and the U.S. dollar in favor of hard assets like gold. In 2025, it was the first time in almost 30 years that central banks around the world held more gold than U.S. treasuries. Think about what that means. For the first time in a generation, the world's central bankers decided that a shiny metal they pull out of the ground is a safer bet than a promise from the United States government. Now, while all of this was happening in Washington, something very different was happening in Beijing. Xi Jinping was not just watching the chaos. He was building. At the center of China's strategy is something most Americans have never heard of. It is called CIPS, the Cross-Border Interbank Payment System. Think of it as China's answer to SWIFT, which is the Western-controlled financial messaging network that connects over 11,000 banks in more than 200 countries and essentially acts as the plumbing of global finance. When the U.S. wanted to punish Russia for invading Ukraine in 2022, what did they do? They kicked Russian banks off SWIFT. It was devastating. It froze $300 billion in Russian reserves overnight. But it also sent a message to every other country on the planet. If you cross Washington, your money is not safe. China took that lesson very seriously. CIPS was launched back in 2015, but it has exploded in recent years. As of late 2025, the system connects approximately 4,900 banks across 187 countries. It now has around 190 direct participants and over 1,500 indirect participants spanning 124 countries and regions. Cumulative payment volume has exceeded 675 trillion yuan, which is roughly 94 trillion US dollars. In April 2025, China launched CIPS 2.0, integrating its digital yuan into the infrastructure, bringing settlement times down to roughly 7 seconds compared to the 3 to 5 days that traditional systems can take. And transaction fees? They dropped from nearly 5% to almost zero for international settlements. Now, CIPS still has a long way to go. SWIFT processes over 44 million messages per day and connects over 11,000 institutions. CIPS is much smaller. About 80% of CIPS transactions still actually use SWIFT messaging because many non-Chinese banks have not adopted CIPS's own messaging standards. But here is the critical point. CIPS does not need to replace SWIFT overnight. It just needs to offer a credible alternative. And for a growing number of countries, especially those that fear American sanctions, that alternative is looking more and more attractive every single day. And China is not doing this alone. The BRICS bloc, which now includes Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, Egypt, Ethiopia, Indonesia, Iran, and the United Arab Emirates, has been accelerating its own de-dollarization agenda at a pace that would have seemed unthinkable just a few years ago. In 2025, BRICS central banks added nearly 800 metric tons of gold to their reserves. Combined BRICS gold reserves now exceed 6,000 tons, representing roughly 20 to 21% of total global central bank gold reserves. Russia leads with 2,336 tons, followed by China with 2,298 tons, and India with 880 tons. In October 2025, researchers launched a pilot to test a gold-anchored settlement unit inside the BRICS bloc. The prototype uses a 40% gold and 60% BRICS currency basket. They are literally building a new monetary system from scratch. And the numbers tell the story of what is happening to the dollar's dominance. In the year 2000, the US dollar made up 71% of global foreign exchange reserves. By the third quarter of 2025, that number had fallen to about 57%. Meanwhile, over 90% of trade between Russia, India, and China now occurs without dollars. One-third of China's own foreign trade is conducted in yuan. The yuan has become the second most used currency for trade finance globally, surpassing the euro. Its share of global foreign exchange transactions has risen from 2.2% in 2013 to 8.5% last year. Now, to be fair, the yuan's share of global reserves is still just 1.93%. That is tiny compared to the dollar. And there are real structural barriers to the yuan becoming a true reserve currency. China maintains strict capital controls. Money does not flow freely in and out of the country. The currency is not fully convertible. Goldman Sachs estimates the yuan is undervalued by as much as 25% against the dollar. These are not small problems. A global reserve currency needs to be freely tradable, widely trusted, and backed by deep, liquid financial markets. China has a long way to go on all of those fronts. But here is what the skeptics are missing. China does not need the yuan to replace the dollar tomorrow. As Han Shenlin of the Asia Group put it, Beijing wants the yuan to be a serious global currency, not necessarily to replace the dollar overnight, but to be a strategic counterweight that limits U.S. leverage in a fracturing financial order. That is a much more achievable goal. And it is one that Trump's policies are making easier every single day. And look at what is happening on the diplomatic front. Since late 2025, there has been a parade of world leaders heading to Beijing. French President Emmanuel Macron visited in December 2025. In January 2026 alone, at least 5 national leaders visited Xi, including British Prime Minister Keir Starmer, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney, South Korean President Lee Jae-myung, Finland's Prime Minister Petteri Orpo, and Ireland's Prime Minister Michael Martin. Nearly 60 British companies sent representatives to accompany Starmer. AstraZeneca announced plans to invest $15 billion in China through 2030. Canada agreed to cut tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles from 100% down to 6.1%. These are not just diplomatic courtesy calls. These are countries that are supposed to be America's closest allies, and they are rushing to Beijing to cut deals because they no longer trust Washington to be a stable partner. As one analyst put, these trips are a hedging strategy. They keep the China Channel open as a way to preserve strategic optionality. In other words, even America's friends are preparing for a world where the dollar is not king. And China is positioning itself perfectly for this moment. While Trump has been threatening allies with tariffs, Xi has been playing the role of the reasonable global statesman. At the World Economic Forum in Davos, Chinese Vice Premier Li Hufeng emphasized China's ongoing support for multilateralism and free trade. He said, while economic globalization is not perfect, the right approach should be to find solutions together through dialogue. Compare that to Trump threatening 100% tariffs on Canada for making deals with China, or telling Britain it is very dangerous to do business with Beijing. Now, I want to be clear about something. I am not saying the dollar is going to collapse. I am not saying the yuan is going to take over next week. The dollar still accounts for 89% of all currency exchanges. About 56% of all foreign currency reserves held by central banks are in dollars. The U.S. financial markets are still the deepest and most liquid in the world. There is massive inertia built into the system. Everyone uses the dollar because everyone else uses the dollar. But what I am saying is that we are witnessing the early stages of a fundamental shift. The dollar's share of reserves has been declining for 25 years, from 71% in 2000 to 57% today. That trend is accelerating. 73% of global central bankers surveyed by the World Gold Council in 2025 said they believe the dollar's share will decrease further over the next 5 years. 75% plan to reduce their exposure to dollar-denominated assets. And here is the real danger. The dollar's dominance is not just about economics. It is about trust. People hold dollars because they trust the U.S. government to honor its debts, to maintain stable monetary policy, and to respect the rule of law. Every time Trump attacks the Fed, every time he launches erratic tariffs that change from one week to the next, every time his administration opens criminal investigations into independent institutions, he chips away at that trust. And trust once lost is almost impossible to rebuild. As Kelvin Lam, a senior economist at Pantheon Macroeconomics, put, China senses the change of the global order more real than before. Beijing is not creating this crisis. Beijing is exploiting it, and it is doing so with a level of strategic patience and sophistication that Washington simply cannot match right now. The Federal Reserve completed 3 rate cuts in 2025, lowering the federal funds rate from 4.75 to 5% down to 3.25 to 3.5%. The federal debt has now exceeded $37 trillion, over 130% of GDP. Trump's One Big Beautiful bill is projected to add another $3.4 trillion in debt over the next decade. He is proposing to increase defense spending by $500 billion over 2 years and send $2,000 checks to most American households funded by tariff revenues. All of this while simultaneously trying to bully the Fed into cutting rates further. The economists at Goldman Sachs, Deutsche Bank, and UBS are all projecting further dollar weakness through 2026. The dollar index is expected to retreat to somewhere between 95 and 99 by year-end. Some analysts are even more bearish. The U.S. GDP growth slowed to 1.8% in 2025, a significant decline. Manufacturing is contracting. The labor market is cooling. And the world is watching all of this and drawing its own conclusions. So where does this leave us? We are at a historical inflection point. The British pound was once the world's reserve currency. It lost that status not in a single dramatic moment, but through a slow, steady erosion of British economic power and global trust. That process took decades, but once it reached a tipping point, the decline accelerated rapidly. The dollar is nowhere near that tipping point yet. But for the first time in the post-war era, we can see it on the horizon. Xi Jinping has made it clear that China is playing the long game. He is building the financial infrastructure, cultivating the diplomatic relationships, and accumulating the gold reserves to be ready when that moment arrives. Whether it comes in 5 years or 50, China intends to be prepared. Meanwhile, in Washington, the man who promised to make America great again appears to be doing everything in his power to trash the very currency that makes American power possible. That is the reality of the world we are living in right now. And whether you like it or not, it is going to affect every single one of you. Your savings, your investments, your purchasing power, and the economic future of your children and grandchildren. I want to hear what you think. Is the dollar's decline inevitable? Can China really pull off the yuan as a reserve currency? Or is this all just noise? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one of them. And if you made it this far, you are exactly the kind of viewer this channel is built for. Smash that like button, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss these deep dive breakdowns. I will see you in the next one.